Just after midnight off the coast of Calais, the greatest invasion fleet the world had ever seen cut its own anchors and ran. Out of the dark came 8 burning ships, riding the wind and the tide straight into the tight-packed Spanish Crescent. The Spanish did not wait to see what was aboard them. They slashed their cables, left their anchors on the seabed, and scattered into the open water. But not one of those 8 ships ever reached them. Not a single Spanish hull burned that night, and the most feared navy afloat never recovered from it. The ships that broke the Spanish Armada in 1588 were worn out, half-rotten, worth almost nothing. Their own crews had stripped anything of value and set them alight on purpose. That is the fireship, the cheapest and most terrifying weapon of the entire age of sail. A dying hull, packed with fire, and pointed at a fleet. Over the next half hour, I want to show you how one of these was actually built, what went into the belly of the ship, and why every piece of it was there. How a handful of men sailed a floating bomb into an anchored fleet and rode away alive. Why a crowd of warships sitting at anchor was the one target a fireship could not miss. And it lets us test one of the most repeated claims about war at sea, that battles were decided by the heaviest broadside, the biggest guns, the most iron in the air. Because every so often, the ship that settled the whole night was the one nobody wanted. If you like history where we hold the famous version up against what the records actually prove, take a second to subscribe to Powder Monkeys. Testing the legend against the evidence is the whole reason this channel exists. Now, to see why the fireship was such a strange weapon, you have to start with the money, because the economics of it are almost upside down. A first-rate warship was close to the most expensive object a country could build. A single one of them swallowed as many as 6,000 mature oak trees, along with miles of rope, tons of iron and canvas and powder, and years of skilled labor, before it ever touched the water. It carried hundreds of men and enough firepower to level a town. Losing one was a national event, the kind of loss a country felt for a decade. The Royal Museums Greenwich have described the Great Warship Program as one of the most costly sustained engineering efforts anywhere in the world before the age of railways. A fireship was the exact reverse of all of that. It was usually a tired old hull at the end of its working life, or a captured enemy prize nobody had a better use for, or a merchant ship too slow and too small to be worth keeping. Something you would otherwise sell for firewood or leave to rot in a mud berth up some tidal creek. It cost almost nothing to buy and almost nothing to lose, and that is the whole engine of the weapon. The ship that did the destroying was worth almost nothing. The ships it destroyed were worth a fortune. That single imbalance is the reason the fireship survived for centuries, right through the golden age of piracy, long after cleverer and more accurate weapons should have retired it for good. To understand why hardened professional sailors were so terrified of a burning hulk drifting toward them, you have to go back 3 years before Calais, to a river in the Low Countries, and to a night that scarred an entire generation of Spanish soldiers. In 1585, the Spanish army had the city of Antwerp under siege. To seal the port off from the sea and starve it into surrender, they built an enormous bridge of boats straight across the river Scheldt, a barricade of lashed hulls and heavy timber that cut the city off from resupply. The defenders had to break that bridge, and they turned to an Italian military engineer named Federico Giambelli, a man with a reputation for building things nobody else would dare to. Giambelli did not build an ordinary fireship. He took 2 ships of about 70 tons each, the Hope and the Fortune, and he gutted them and turned each one into a floating mine. Inside the hold of each ship, he built a sealed chamber with brick walls and a stone floor, and he packed that chamber with thousands of pounds of gunpowder. Then he rigged it to a fuse. He hid these 2 monsters inside a crowd of around 30 ordinary fireships, so the Spanish would see a routine attack and never know which of the burning shapes was the real threat. And he sent the whole flotilla drifting down the current toward the bridge in the dark. At first, it looked like a failure. Most of the fireships did nothing. One of Giambelli's 2 mines grounded short of the bridge, and its charge barely went off. The Spanish soldiers on the barricade laughed at the whole effort. Some of them climbed aboard the second ship where it had lodged against the bridge, working to shove it clear and stamp out the small fires on its deck before they could spread. And then the fuse reached the powder. The blast tore a gap 60 feet wide straight through the bridge and killed at least 800 Spanish soldiers in a single instant. Men were thrown bodily into the river. Whole spans of heavy timber simply vanished. Stones and iron rained down for hundreds of yards. It was, by some accounts, the deadliest man-made explosion the world had yet produced. The Dutch were too stunned to exploit it, and the Spanish rebuilt the bridge and took Antwerp the following year anyway. but the lesson outlived the siege. For every man who survived that night, and for every soldier and sailor who heard the story told and retold in the years after, one idea was now burned in permanently. A single ship, worth nothing, prepared the right way, could erase hundreds of men and a fortune in engineering in less time than it takes to draw a breath. So 3 years later, when 8 dark shapes came burning down on the Armada off Calais, the Spanish commanders were not looking at a simple bonfire drifting on the tide. They were seeing the bridge on the Scheldt all over again. That memory is the reason the whole story turns the way it does, and we will come back to it. First, though, let me show you what was actually inside one of these ships. Because by the later 1600s, the Fireship was not just a hull that somebody touched a torch to. Navies were building and converting them to a genuine specification, in dedicated yards, by men who did nothing else. And every single feature of that specification existed to serve one purpose: make the fire catch instantly, hold, and spread faster than any crew alive could fight it. The heart of the ship was the fire chamber. Shipwrights built it in the space between the decks, running from up near the bow all the way back to a bulkhead behind the mainmast, and they filled that long, low room with everything that burns hot and clings and will not be put out: resin, pitch, tar, tallow, brimstone, which is the old word for sulfur, for that choking chemical stink and the way it feeds a flame, bundles of dry brushwood that the sailors called bavins, old canvas and worn rope, soaked in oil so they would catch in an instant, and laid down in the middle of all of it, gunpowder, packed into iron pots and vessels, so that when it went, it came with a blast, and not just a flare. The 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, drawing its account directly from period naval practice, lays out exactly this: a fire chamber built between the decks and filled with resin and pitch and tallow and tar, together with gunpowder in iron vessels, the whole of it linked by trains of powder. To make sure that fire caught the whole ship at once, the shipwrights did something no other warship would ever allow. They tore up the main deck and laid a false deck of open lattice below it, and stacked the combustibles on that lattice work. The gaps in the lattice meant air could reach the fire from underneath, so that the moment it lit, it had draft, it breathed, and it climbed. On any other ship in the fleet, a fire below decks was the single worst thing that could happen, and every man aboard was trained to smother it. On a fireship, the entire hull was engineered to do the opposite, to take a spark and turn it into an inferno on purpose. Then there is the second key idea: the trains of powder. A fire that starts in one corner and spreads slowly gives the enemy time. Time to see it, understand it, cut it loose, shove it away with a spar. So the men fitting out a fireship laid powder trails and fire troughs, long channels of tin or wood filled with combustibles, running the length of the ship fore and aft and out to the sides. Light one end, and the flame did not crawl. It raced down the troughs and lit every part of the ship in the same few seconds. Above them, they hung fire barrels rigged to vent their flames straight up into the sails and the rigging, so the fire climbed the masts as fast as it ran along the deck. But a fire needs air, and a sealed wooden hull will choke it. So the fireship was cut open in ways that would have horrified any normal shipwright. Square chimneys were let into the deck above the fire chamber to pull the draft upward and keep it roaring. And the gun ports, the hinged square doors along the sides that a warship runs its cannon through, were rebuilt to hang from the bottom edge instead of the top. On a normal ship, those ports are held open by rope, and rope in a fire burns through and lets them slam shut. On a fireship, gravity did the work instead. The moment the vessel heeled and the blaze took hold, every port along both sides fell open on its own and stayed open, feeding a steady river of oxygen straight into the fire chamber. Some builders went further still and packed small charges of powder into the ports themselves, so they would blow outward as the flames arrived, throwing fire out across the water toward whatever was alongside. And then there is the one piece of engineering that mattered more than all the rest, because it is the thing that turned a burning ship from a hazard you could dodge into a weapon you could not shake off. Out on the ends of the yardarms, the long horizontal spars that hold the sails, the crew fitted heavy iron grappling hooks and lengths of chain. The entire point of a fireship is contact. It has to reach its target and stay there long enough to set it alight. So when the fireship came alongside its victim, those hooks swung in and caught in the enemy's rigging and rope, and locked the two ships together in a burning embrace. A fire that is merely drifting near you can be fended off with a long spar or towed clear by a ship's boat. A fire that has hooked its iron claws into your own rigging and will not come loose is a completely different kind of problem. And to keep the fireship driving forward under sail right up to that final moment, The shipwrights wrapped the bases of the masts in casings they called coffer dams, meant to shield the masts from the flames just long enough that the ship kept its own sails and its own steering all the way in, instead of catching fire early and stopping dead in the water before it ever arrived. Put every one of those features together, and you have a machine with a single, simple, murderous purpose: reach the enemy, lock on, go up completely. When a fireship was properly fitted and properly lit, it could be burning from stem to stern, masthead to waterline, inside about 5 minutes. Which raises the obvious question, and it is the question that separates the men who fit these ships out from the men who had to sail them. If the whole thing is engineered to become a total inferno in 5 minutes, who in their right mind is standing on the deck when it lights, and how on earth do they get off? The answer is a skeleton crew. Not the 200 or 300 men who worked a real warship, but a small hand-picked party, sometimes only a dozen men, and their entire job was to steer this floating bomb into the middle of an enemy fleet and set it burning at the last possible second. And the timing was a knife edge, cutting both ways. Light it too early, and the enemy sees the flames climbing, understands what is bearing down on them, and simply turns away, or blows the fireship apart with a broadside long before it arrives. Light it too late, and you burn with the ship. So these men held their course and held their nerve, sails set and drawing, running straight at a wall of enemy cannon on a vessel filled to the deckhead with gunpowder, and they did not so much as strike a spark until they were almost close enough to touch the target with an outstretched hand. Then came the run for their lives. The fuses on a fireship were all led back to one door, built low into the stern, often tucked between the two rearmost gun ports. Sailors called it the sally port. When the moment came, the crew touched off the trains of powder, ducked out through that little door, and dropped into a small boat that had been towed astern of the fireship the entire way in, and then they rowed. They rowed as if their lives depended on it, which they did, because behind them their own ship was climbing into a pillar of fire and driving on into the enemy under her own sails, hooks out, guns cooking off in the heat, while they pulled at the oars in the dark, with the glare of it lighting the water and the heat of it on their backs. It was, without any exaggeration, one of the most dangerous jobs in any navy on Earth. A premature spark, a sudden shift of wind, a fuse that burned faster than it was cut to, and the entire crew was simply gone, blown into the sea before they reached the boat. The Royal Navy understood exactly how much it was asking of these men. Britain offered a standing reward to any captain who successfully carried a fireship in against the enemy. £100 in hard cash, a serious sum for the time, or in place of the money, a gold chain with a medal, to be worn afterward as a public mark of honor. That is not a reward you offer for a job that men are lining up to take. So that is the ship, and that is the crew who took it in. Now the target, because a fireship was very nearly useless against an enemy who could see it coming and had open water to move in. Think through what the weapon actually needs in order to work. It has to physically reach another ship and lock onto it while it burns. A warship under sail in open water, with a good crew and sea room around it, has an answer to every part of that. It can put the helm over and turn out of the path. It can send its own boats out to grapple the oncoming fireship and tow it away before it arrives. It can simply aim a broadside and blow the thing apart while it is still coming on. And a fireship stuffed with powder and combustibles is not a hard target to sink. Naval writers and sailors of the period were blunt about this. In the open sea, a fireship often did more to hamper its own fleet than the enemy's. It was easy to sink, easy to tow aside, and it had a grim habit of killing its own crews when the powder went off before its time. As a ship-to-ship weapon in a fair fight, it was clumsy and unreliable. But take that exact same fireship and send it against a fleet lying at anchor, and every one of those defenses falls apart. A fleet at anchor is crammed together into a defined space, very often in a harbor or a coastal roadstead, with land close on one side and shallows on the other. The ships cannot simply sail away, because sailing away means getting underway from a standing start, hauling up anchors, setting sail, finding steerage, and that takes long minutes they do not have, in water where they may have no room to turn. They are packed in close to one another, so a fire that fastens onto one ship can leap straight to the next. And every single one of those hulls is a warship, which is to say every single one of them is sitting on top of its own magazine, its own store of gunpowder, waiting. Against a fleet that can move, a fireship is a nuisance. Against a fleet that cannot, it is a death sentence. A crowded anchorage was the one place on Earth where the cheapest ship in the entire war could reach out and touch the most expensive ships in the war and set every one of them ablaze. And here is the part that turned an awkward, clumsy weapon into something that decided battles. Very often, it did not need to actually burn anything at all. Go back to Calais one final time, because now the whole scene finally makes sense. The Armada was anchored off the French coast, packed into that famous tight crescent formation, waiting to link up with a Spanish army before crossing the Channel to invade England. As long as it held that formation, it was, by the standards of the day, very nearly unbeatable. The English had spent a week chasing it up the Channel and firing at it from long range, with almost nothing to show for it. Then the Spanish anchored and stopped moving, and gave the English the one opening they had been praying for. The English took 8 worn-out ships, filled them with pitch and tar and powder, set them alight, and let the wind and the tide carry them down onto the crowded anchorage in the dark. And the Spanish commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, made a decision that had almost nothing to do with the fires he could actually see, and almost everything to do with the memory of Antwerp. He looked at those 8 burning ships, and he believed they might be hellburners, floating bombs that would take half his fleet down with them when they blew. He was not willing to gamble the invasion of England on being wrong, so he gave the order to cut and run. Captains up and down the Crescent slashed their anchor cables rather than waste the time it took to haul them up, and in the darkness the panic ships began to collide with one another as the whole formation tore itself apart. By first light, the Crescent was gone. The English closed in on the scattered, disordered fleet the next day at the Battle of Gravelines, and did the real killing with gunfire at close range. The Armada never reformed, never linked up with its army, and was driven north into storms it would not survive. And here is what the legend usually leaves out. Not one of those 8 fireships actually struck a Spanish ship. Not one Spaniard burned to death that night. The weapon did its entire work through fear. The sight of fire coming out of the dark, sitting on top of the memory of what fire had already done at Antwerp, was enough to make the most feared fleet in the world tear its own formation to pieces, trying to get away. That is the thing a fireship could do that no cannon ever could. It went after the enemy's nerve first, and sometimes that was the only blow it needed to land. Once navies fully understood that, the fireship stopped being an improvisation and became a permanent planned part of the fleet. By the Great Sea Wars of the later 1600s, both the English and the Dutch kept dedicated fireships attached to their battle lines, crewed, and ready to be sent, in the instant the enemy became crowded or pinned against a shore. At the Battle of Solebay in 1672, the 2 fleets between them brought something on the order of 20 to 30 of these ships to the fight. In fact, admirals had grown so afraid of being caught helpless at anchor that the simple threat of a fireship attack began to shape where they were willing to lie, and when they were willing to fight at all. The cheap weapon was now steering the decisions of men commanding the most expensive fleets on Earth. The English had already learned that lesson in the most humiliating way imaginable, in their own home waters. In June of 1667, near the end of the Second War against the Dutch, the Crown was effectively bankrupt after the Plague and the Great Fire of London, and much of the Royal Navy's best fleet was laid up in the River Medway at Chatham, undermanned and unpaid, riding at anchor behind an iron chain strung across the river. The Dutch Admiral Michiel de Ruyter sailed a fleet straight up the Medway, fireships included, broke through the chain, and fell on the laid-up English ships where they sat. The results were catastrophic. Fireships and boarding parties burned the great English warships at their moorings, ships with names like the Royal Oak and the Royal James and the Loyal London. Some of them set alight by the Dutch, some of them sunk by the English themselves in a panic to keep them out of enemy hands. And the pride of the entire Navy, the flagship Royal Charles, was boarded, captured, and towed back to Holland as a trophy, where a piece of her survives in a Dutch museum to this day. Samuel Pepys, who ran the Navy's paperwork as an official of the Navy Board and left one of the great first-hand accounts of the age, recorded the whole disaster in his diary with something close to despair. It remains one of the worst defeats in the entire history of the Royal Navy, and the weapon at the center of it was the same worn-out, throwaway hull filled with fire that the Spanish had fled from off Calais nearly 80 years before. And when a fleet did get itself pinned in open water, the results were exactly as brutal as the theory promised. In 1692, off the coast of Normandy, a French fleet was caught after the Battle of Barfleur and hunted down over several days. The most badly damaged French ships were driven ashore near Cherbourg and near the village of Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue, run up onto the beach and left aground, which is to say they were now in the single worst position a wooden warship can ever be in. They could not move, could not maneuver, could not run. The Anglo-Dutch fleet sent in its boats and its fireships to finish them where they lay. 15 French ships of the line were burned to the waterline over those few days, 3 of them at Cherbourg and 12 more on the beach at Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue. Among them was the Soleil Royal, the flagship of the French admiral, one of the most magnificent warships ever built in the entire age of sail. A floating palace of carving and gold leaf and heavy guns, she was set ablaze and destroyed by a small English fireship named Blaze. One more worn-out hull, sent in to do the job the fleet's own great guns could not do from a distance. Now, all of that is navies and empires and great set-piece battles. But the fireship belonged just as much to the men this channel is really about, the pirates and the privateers. Because a fireship is the perfect weapon for a weaker force that has been cornered by a stronger one, and there is no better example in the whole Golden Age than the most famous pirate escape of the era. In the last week of July, 1718, the Golden Age of piracy reached a hinge point, and it happened in the harbor of Nassau. For years, Nassau had been the unofficial capital of the pirate world, a lawless port on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, where the great names of the age came and went as they pleased and answered to no crown at all. And then Britain decided to take it back. They sent in Woodes Rogers, a hard former privateer, newly appointed as royal governor, and he sailed into that harbor with a squadron of Royal Navy warships and a single offer in his hand: the king's pardon. Give up piracy for good, take the pardon, and walk away a free man with a clean slate. It was a genuinely generous deal, and most of the men in Nassau took it. One captain point-blank refused. His name was Charles Vane, and he was trapped. Rogers had the main entrance to the harbor blocked with his warships, and Vane's own ship was too large to escape through the other, shallower channel. He was boxed into the anchorage by a Royal Navy squadron, which was the exact situation that should have ended his career on the spot at the end of a rope. So Vane reached for the cheapest weapon on the water. He took a captured French prize that he had no further use for, and he had his men fitted out as a fireship, filling it with combustibles the way sailors had been doing for well over 100 years by then. And then he added one detail of pure spite. He loaded the prize's own guns with a double charge of shot and left them run out, so that when the flames reached them, they would fire on their own, blasting iron out into the dark and adding real danger to the confusion. That night, Vane cut his own vessel free, tucked it in close behind the blazing prize, where the squadron could not get a clean shot at him, and drove the fireship straight at the blockade. And the Royal Navy did the one thing every fleet on Earth does when fire comes at it in the dark. The warships cut their own cables and sheared off to get clear of it, and the double-shotted guns of the burning prize went off one after another in the heat as she bore down on them. In the gap that opened up, Vane slipped his ship out through the harbor entrance and vanished into open water, and he went on raiding for the better part of 3 more years before the sea finally caught up with him. The fireship itself burned almost nothing. It damaged one of Rogers' ships at the very most and destroyed none of them. But that was never the point. The General History of the Pirates, printed in 1724, records the moment almost flatly. The pirates of Nassau submitted and took their certificates of pardon, all of them except Vane and his crew, who, the very moment they saw the men of war come in, slipped their cable, set fire to a prize, and made their escape. One worthless burning hull had cracked open a Royal Navy blockade and let the most defiant pirate in the Bahamas stroll out the front door. That is the fireship working exactly the way the weak had always used it, as the last card of a side that could not win the straight fight and only needed to get out from under a stronger enemy that had it cornered. Which brings us right back around to the claim we started with. That sea battles were decided by the biggest guns, the heaviest broadside, the ship with the most iron in the air. And the honest answer, the one the actual records support, is that most of the time, that is true. The Armada campaign itself is often called the first great naval battle in which heavy gunfire played the leading role. The line of battle, the towering 3-deckers, the long grinding exchange of broadsides, that genuinely is how the major fleet actions of this whole era were decided. If you want one general rule for war at sea in this whole era, more guns and better gunnery is a very good one, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But the fireship is the standing exception that the rule cannot swallow, and that is exactly why it is worth understanding. It was slow. It was clumsy. It was close to useless against an enemy with room to run, and in the open sea, a decent captain could dodge it, tow it aside, or sink it, and it killed its own crews often enough to earn every ounce of that gold medal. And yet, against a fleet at anchor, a fleet aground, a fleet becalmed, a fleet packed in too tightly to move, It did the one thing no gun in the fleet could do. It reached the most valuable ships afloat, with a hull worth nothing at all. And again it broke whole fleets that never even took a direct hit, purely through fear. Sometimes the thing that won was not the biggest gun in the fleet. It was the ship nobody wanted, set on fire, and pointed the right way. The Fireship faded out in the end, the way that every weapon eventually does. Iron hulls and steam engines made a drifting wooden bonfire harmless, took away the crowded sail-powered anchorage that the weapon depended on, and the tactic that had terrified sailors for 300 years quietly disappeared from the sea. But for the entire span of the age of sail, from the burning bridge at Antwerp to the burning harbor at Nassau, one hard fact held true. The most valuable ships in any fleet could be reached, and broken, by the ship that fleet would never have missed. If you got something out of this one, take a second to subscribe, and then tell me one thing down in the comments. If you had been the Duke of Medina Sidonia that night off Calais, watching 8 burning ships drift down toward your anchored fleet, would you have held your position and trusted they were only fireships? Or would you have cut your cables and run the way he did? I genuinely want to know how you would have called it, so make your case below. I read them. And next time, we are staying right here with the weapon that actually did decide those broadside battles. The great guns themselves, and the deadliest job on the entire ship, the boys who ran the gunpowder up from the magazine while the shot was flying. The powder monkeys this channel is named for. Watch that one next.